Hello, welcome back to this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. My name is Aaron Wenlin. I'm Vision Fellow in Public Philosophy at King's College London and a Senior Research Fellow at Massey College, Toronto, and I'm honored to be hosting this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis, and it's meant to generate support for establishing a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. This center will in turn provide support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine who are doing fantastic work in very difficult circumstances. We'll put some information up on the screen that will enable you to contribute to this cause, and we encourage you to give generously. That said, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Kate Manne. Kate is an associate professor of philosophy at Cornell University. She has written 2 books, Down Girl, The Logic of Misogyny, and entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women. And she is currently working on a 3rd book called Unshrinking, How to Face Fat Phobia. She regularly writes opinion pieces, essays, and reviews on moral and political topics for a wider audience, and her public work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Politico. The title of Kate's talk is Philosophy and Gaslighting. It's Not All in Your Mind. Kate, thanks so much for participating in this benefit event, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing the event and for having me. So a couple of years ago, I was privy via a friend to a discussion around hiring that had taken place in their philosophy department. Not mine, I assure you. Depressingly, it was an even higher ranking department. Some faculty members had expressed concern that their short list of candidates included only 2 women and 8 men. Other faculty members pushed back against this worry. It's a meritocracy in philosophy. We want to hire the best person, regardless of gender, as if that would be what would be achieved via these gendered implicit biases. One man actually said out loud in front of his female colleagues, "We've gone the affirmative action route in the past, and it's been a disaster. Women in philosophy are just crazy." I was reminded of this incident recently by a depressingly similar anecdote recounted to me by another friend. Yes, these are just anecdotes, but the data, as well as personal experience, suggests these problems are systemic. Philosophy is not just white male dominated, it is systematically misogynistic, as well as racist, classist, ableist, transphobic, homophobic, and, as I've been arguing recently, fatphobic. So why do I stay in it? What is the point? It's depressing. The truth is, much as I think philosophy attracts a certain kind of person who uses the tools of the discipline to establish and maintain dominance, the status quo, etc., philosophy also has the power to help us push back against such people. More broadly, it can arm those of us who care to fight important battles for social justice. Of particular concern to me today, it can help us to combat gaslighting in the discipline and beyond it, and thus to combat attitudes like the ones that we saw betrayed by the man in my opening incident. I think the result is not so much a paradox or even a tension, but just an awkward social fact. Philosophy both contains numerous gaslighters, and it can help us to free ourselves of their influence. It can also make us more insightful about the ways in which we ourselves might unwittingly act in ways which gaslight others, or at least discourage their disagreement. And it can help us to do better. I want to begin here by introducing you to the basic original story of the gaslighter via the play Gaslight, sometimes also known as Angel Street, by Patrick Hamilton. Then I'll tell you my definition of gaslighting and highlight some features of the definition. I'll then draw on an insight of Kate Abramson's to explain the situation in philosophy as I see it, and to do with the way that gaslighters are constitutionally allergic to the kind of healthy disagreement which we ought to be fostering and encouraging. So gaslighting takes its name from the 1938 Patrick Hamilton play Angel Street, which was performed on stage as Gaslight. The play was subsequently made into two films by the latter name, both the US and UK version, and those films have become better known than the original play. But the play is, to my mind, richer than either film, so I want to use it as the basis for the discussion here, a discussion in which I draw on my 2020 book entitled How Male Privilege Hurts Women, specifically Chapter 8, which is called Unassuming. In Gaslight, as I'm referring to it, Mr. Manningham appears to be intent on sending his wife, Bella, insane. His original motives for doing so only become apparent during the end of the first act of the play, but importantly, his behavior is intelligible right from the beginning, lending the play its claustrophobic, indeed suffocating atmosphere. Act 1 is a vivid depiction of domestic terror. Mr. Manningham wrong-foots and undermines his wife at every turn, humiliating her in front of their servant, correcting her constantly, and even impugning the anxiety he is thereby instilling in her as irrational and baseless. There's a moment where he says, "Why are you so apprehensive, Bella? I was not about to reproach you." And Bella replies, "No, dear, I know you weren't." He goes on to reproach, indeed berate her shortly thereafter. In a particularly cruel and long-running series of manipulations, Mr. Manningham has led his wife to believe that she's going out of her mind and losing possession of her rational faculties by regularly hiding their possessions around their home and then holding her responsible for their disappearance. And he holds her responsible not merely causally, but morally, depicting her as mischievous and wicked, as well as confused and delusional. He also accuses her most painfully of all of deliberately hurting their pet dog, thus painting her as the cruel and abusive one. She actually loves the dog dearly and would never do anything to hurt her pet. Now, the combination of accusations at stake here is, of course, incoherent, as Bella Manningham actually tries repeatedly to point out to her husband. If she really was confused and delusional and couldn't help her behavior, then surely he should be trying to help her and treating her kindly rather than getting angry. But Mr. Manningham ignores this, as he does with all of his wife's attempts to prevail upon his goodwill. She's truly powerless within her household, and she is nobody outside of it, since Mr. Manningham has deliberately isolated her from all of her friends and relatives. So she has no choice but to defer to him, and even then it does little to appease his seething temper. The effect of Mr. Manningham's behavior, a devastating portrait of a recognizable pattern of abuse, which subsequently came to be known as gaslighting, is to deprive Bella of her sense of entitlement to state even the most basic realities. Towards the end of Act 1, in an arguably disappointing Deus Ex Machina, a detective comes to visit her and tells her this terrible, albeit liberating truth. Her husband, Mr. Manningham, is actually the diabolical Sidney Power, who murdered the former resident of their home, Alice Barlow, in order to steal the famous Barlow rubies. Mr. Manningham, aka Sidney Power, slit Barlow's throat to silence her some 15 years prior. But he may never have managed to locate the rubies. Detective Ruff thinks and confides in Bella, and the detective has come to the conclusion that he is still looking for the jewels on the top floor of the house, which is in fact why he persuaded Bella to buy this house with her family money. So this top floor of the house is shut up and off limits to everyone but him. Even the servants can't go up here. So that's the background for this piece of dialogue I'll now give you. So might he be looking for the jewels upstairs in this attic, this shut up attic every evening? He might indeed, Bella realizes. So Bella says, "It all sounds so incredible when I'm alone at night, but I get the idea that somebody's walking about up there. At night when my husband's out, I hear noises from my bedroom, but I'm too afraid to go up." The detective asks, "Have you told your husband this?" And Bella says, "No, I'm afraid to." He gets angry. He says, "I imagine things which don't exist." Detective Ruff asks, "It never struck you, did it, that it might be your own husband walking about up there?" Bella Manningham says, "Yes, that is what I thought, but I thought I must be mad." "Tell me how you know." Detective says, "Tell me how you knew, Mrs. Manningham." Bella says, it's true, I knew it. Notice the epistemic language here. So Bella did indeed know deep down that her husband was creeping about upstairs because, and this is where the term gaslighting comes from, 10 minutes after her husband went out every evening, ostensibly outside, the gas light in her bedroom would ebb. And 10 minutes later, 10 minutes before he came back, it would return to its former full flame. Now, what that meant in Victorian England was that the gas light was ebbing because another light had been switched on, then off again somewhere else in the house. And Bella Manningham realized that it could only be happening in the attic, where this other gas light must have been turned on, siphoning pressure away from the light in her bedroom. So you see, it's kind of a complicated and much subtler setup than in the film, where the husband actually denies the wife's perception of the gaslight flickering. Here, Bella Manningham was forced to deny and could barely admit to herself what she actually knew. Her husband's epistemic domination over her was so total that she didn't dare to question his movements, let alone his motives. His sense of entitlement was so great to maintain this dominant narrative that she was the one who felt guilty for entertaining even the slightest doubts about her scurrilous lying husband. From the very beginning of the play, exchanges like the following show how little latitude she has to question either the rightness of his beliefs or the benevolence of his actions. In Act 1, she ventures hopefully, "Oh, Jack, dear, you have been so much kinder lately. Is it possible you're beginning to see my point of view?" Mr. Manningham replies, "I don't know that I ever differed from it, did I, Bella?" "Oh, Jack, dear, it's true, says Bella Manningham. So in the context of the action as a whole, it's clear she's not allowed to question his kindness, a particular cruelty. And she doesn't even bring up the gaslight's flickering because she knows it would lead to rage on his part. So let's back up here and now do some philosophy. I've argued based on these and other similar real-life cases that gaslighting should be understood as follows: a systematic process that makes someone feel defective in some way, morally, rationally, or even health-wise, for mental states like beliefs, desires, intentions, bodily states, and so on, to which they are in reality entitled. So this definition is partly my attempt to make sense of the fact that gaslighting may but need not be intentional. Notice that we don't require even an agent in order to make this definition of gaslighting work. Gaslighting may but need not involve this individual agent who is trying to harm us, as in the paradigm cases. And this makes sense of the fact that, as the philosopher Elena Ruiz has insightfully argued, gaslighting can also be perpetrated against people by whole collectives and practices and institutions, and thus constitute a purely structural phenomenon in some cases. For example, one perpetrated by white supremacy and the associated colonialist practices against people of color. Okay, but nonetheless, this definition still makes sense of the fact that some individuals do gaslight, and we can now ask an obvious question: why do individuals do this exactly? And here I want to draw on an insight of Kate Abramson's, who offers, I think, a brilliant answer to this question. In her view, the gaslighter, considered as an individual agent, is someone who cannot abide by disagreement. He is not just anxious about, but almost allergic to, being successfully contradicted. Other points of view, other perspectives are verboten to him. They're anathema to him. You see why I included that quote about Bella wondering whether her husband might be beginning to see her point of view, because that's exactly what the gaslighter shuts down, as he does indeed in that exchange, by saying, "We never differed." To quote Kate Abramson on this phenomenon of this kind of allergy to disagreement, what makes the difference between the fellow who ignores or dismisses evidence that his desires cannot be satisfied versus the one who gaslights is the inability to tolerate even the possibility of challenge, end quote. Okay, and this is from her 2014 piece in Phil Perspectives, Turning Up the Lights on Gaslighting. But we should reflect that the gaslighter is someone who can't tolerate challenges in a particular way. He doesn't simply kill his victim, which would be another surefire way of preventing her from challenging him, as Abramson also points out. Unless you object here that he may have some kind of compunction about murder, reflect that our paradigm case of a gaslighter is someone who is also a murderer, albeit with respect to different targets and victims. And this is also true, by the way, in many real life cases. We find that these are also, in the most extreme cases of gaslighting, people willing to murder others. But when it comes to the target of the gaslighting, this won't work, this idea of just eliminating someone's perspective by eliminating them. Because the gaslighter wants to maintain the appearance, the illusion of an ongoing conversation, a dialectic, and a subject who is capable of disagreeing with him. And he wants to invariably win the argument, or forestall it in the first place, making for a series of Pyrrhic victories. He wants to set things up so that he will get to feel like he has prevailed, even though in reality he set things up so that the victim really doesn't dare to question him. I was reminded when I was thinking about this of a quote, of a line of Donald Trump's, which he said in the lead up to the 2016 election, "We're going to win so much, we're going to get sick and tired of winning." A kind of inadvertent stroke of brilliance via his usual malapropism and cliche strategy. Okay, so to get back to the kind of issue of how philosophy might be attracted to people who gaslight, how it might in fact attract gaslighting types, even represent at its worst a culture of gaslighting, you get to kind of imply in philosophy at particular points that it's not just that other people are wrong, it's that they're irrational or sotto voce crazy. They're missing something obvious. They're reasoning poorly or even displaying poor moral character in as much as they take a different view, a different perspective. They are oversensitive, or they're too woke, or they're just not talented enough to see the truth. Again, this is a direct quote that I've heard in the context of philosophers trying to establish dominance over other people in the room. Or insert any other summarily dismissive and monolithic intellectual character assessment of the kind that is acceptable in philosophy and in very few other disciplines. So I think that this is gaslighting, or at least channels the spirit that gaslighting exemplifies by shutting down healthy disagreement. I'm guessing this dynamic will be familiar to many people in the audience. But here's the good news. Philosophy is a discipline which prides itself not only on being a paradigmatically rational enterprise, which is something I could do without, to be honest, especially when we're doing so to compare ourselves flatteringly to other humanities disciplines. But more positively, philosophy is also one that encourages everyone to ask questions and to push back against almost anything and almost anyone for almost any reason. So I think philosophy actually has the tools and the power, not just to provide us with important, conceptual wherewithal here, but also just as importantly, the social wherewithal to challenge gaslighting inside and outside of the discipline. It can make us able to say, no, wait on, that actually doesn't sound right to me. And is that really irrational or crazy to think or to do? Or is it in fact an important challenge to a prevailing and powerful orthodoxy? That's something we can do in philosophy. And in fact, it is socially sometimes encouraged in our discipline. So I want to be clear here. Am I hence saying that we need to be open to any argument whatsoever? Not quite. I think that would be too simple. There are arguments and views which strike me as genuinely beyond the pale. For a simple principled reason, and one which indeed resonates with the goal of having a gaslighting resistant or anti-gaslighting philosophical practice. I think there are views which say effectively that some people do not deserve to be heard, either explicitly or implicitly, for example, by denying their humanity or their obviously authoritative lived experience and their testimony about who they are or what they go through in the world. I think both trans people and disabled people are often subject to these forms of pernicious denial in philosophy, and it in fact has much to do with the way some people are gaslit. It has much the same effect as gaslighting in systematically keeping certain voices and perspectives out of the conversation. We've seen this might be achieved in other cases in very concrete material ways by calling female philosophers crazy as a rationale for not hiring us. So the general principle I'm gesturing towards, and I think this will be too simple for a bunch of reasons, but it's like just a first pass attempt. It might go something like this. We should be open to any disagreement and count it as a valid one, in as much as it doesn't systematically exclude or prevent some people from entering into disagreements because of their social identities. Here's like a very rough analogy to kind of motivate thinking along these lines. Perhaps we should be prepared to democratically deliberate or vote about any matter, except taking the vote away from some subjects within a deliberative democracy on the basis of who they are as subjects. So it's something like that structure. How then, I think the question remains practically, do we do philosophy in this kind of anti-gaslighting, gaslighting resistant, or broadly democratic spirit? How do we take firm stands ourselves sometimes, as I have myself here today, without unwittingly encouraging others to fall into line, or even perhaps gaslighting them unintentionally if we have some form of authority over them? So I won't pretend this is an easy task, but I think it is at least possible. Think about what we do when we're teaching, for example. I think we find ourselves regularly capable of defending a certain position, which we may sometimes truly believe in. We don't always play devil's advocate in the classroom, but we do so in a way, I hope, that allows and indeed invites intelligent, respectful disagreement from our students. We hold forth and we are perhaps passionate about the views we defend, but then we listen. And we may or may not adjust our views going forward. We may or may not even be open to doing so, but we are open to others' dissent. Our practice is geared towards making space for it in an ongoing conversation. More broadly, we regard some disagreements as one we do have a stake in, but nevertheless do not want to win, in the sense of convincing everyone else that they are necessarily mistaken. Rather, I think we can sometimes regard fruitful, intelligent disagreement, not convergence, as the epistemic gold standard and the aim of the exercise. And we can regard ourselves as one epistemic community member among others who does not want to prevail, again, necessarily. We want to be a part of an ongoing and historical conversation and to play our small part in it. Perhaps at its best, the philosophical community can be like this, and hence inviting to everyone, rather than dismissing some historically excluded people as crazy or similar. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. I really enjoyed the talk. If you don't mind, I'm going to follow up with a couple of questions. And maybe I begin with what seems to be the two, let's say philosophy is a double-headed monster, or something to this effect, that there's, or maybe monster is the wrong word, but two sides of philosophy, potentially the good guy and the bad guy. That maybe is a better way to look at this. So the bad bit of philosophy is in some way its focus on, if I understand this right, the way you can use appeal to rationality and argumentation to dismiss other people as rational, right? The gaslighter can't tolerate challenges. And this happens in philosophy where people dismiss other people as irrational or offering poor arguments or something to that effect. And the good person, or the good cop in philosophy, is the one that constantly questions um, any established sort of position or almost any sort of established position. And I guess my question more generally is, where does reason sit in between these two positions? Or is there a place for reason in between these two positions? Because you might say that, okay, it can be used, or appeals to reason can be used to dismiss other people as irrational. But I take it you don't want to throw reason away completely. There still seems to be a space for rationality and irrationality within philosophy, even if there is sort of questioning and so on. So I guess what do you imagine the place of reason being in philosophy? Is there a positive use, and is it not necessarily always used for gaslighting or something to that
Yeah,
effect?
I mean, absolutely. I think it's all in the way we kind of wield not so much the tools of rationality, which I have no problem with, but really the rhetoric of rationality is tricky.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one way to do it well is to say, look, when we think about this and really reason our way through these assumptions or this way of doing things and look behind the curtain, I think there's room to, and then observe, whatever it is, or offer the particular view that you have of the subject that is, um, you know, heterodox, or offer an argument that is intended to be a rational argument for an established conclusion. But one can do so, I think, in the spirit not of anyone who disagrees with me is necessarily irrational, but here's how I see things using the rational tools at my disposal. And this may be a subject where rational minds can disagree. I think that's often a surprisingly useful phrase to make it clear that this is controversial, this is tricky, and I might have missed something. I
Mm-hmm.
actually find myself using that phrase again tellingly in the classroom, where you can see that very intelligent and learned and thoughtful people have gone different ways based on different lines of reasoning and ended up with
Mm-hmm.
opposite or at least mutually exclusive conclusions. So I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a way of saying, here's the product of my chain of reasoning, um, but without implying that anyone would be irrational or, again, sort of voce kind of crazy for taking a
Mm-hmm.
different view of things. So, in some ways, this is a defense of a non or an anti dogmatic stance in the discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, certainly not against rationality, but I do think the way we use the language of rationality rhetorically, we should be careful to check that we're not implying on deservedly controversial matters that anyone who takes a different view is irrational or otherwise defective.
Good, that's helpful. Maybe one more quick sort of follow up. There was a point in the discussion where I thought where you were going completely was basically life in a philosophy department is the same as life in the play Gaslight.
Oh,
And
no.
no, I understand. But I suppose my question is, if there are these sort of gaslighting tendencies within philosophy, you began by saying that there's also a reason, you raised the question why you continue to do philosophy. So there must be things that you sort of value or you think of as good
Mm-hmm.
within philosophy. And we don't need to have a whole sort of discussion about this, but I just maybe briefly some of the positive things that you've found either being in philosophy or doing philosophy, what it's helped you achieve, a
Well,
couple.
yeah, this is very much linked to the talk, and I am so glad for the question because I didn't quite have time to get into it. But again, like I think about teaching, and a lot of my students are historically, come from a group that has been marginalized or oppressed or excluded in some way. I pride myself on someone who I think attracts a somewhat higher proportion of students who are coming from non-traditional philosophical backgrounds, as in they're not white men necessarily, although I have wonderful white male students too. Hashtag not all men, blah, blah, blah. Um, but I think the thing that I really like is disagreement is actually a little bit socially frowned upon for a lot of historically excluded people. Even just as a woman, you're often not really entitled in ordinary conversation to just say things like, I think that's false. Here's, a counterexample, or here's, an argument that conclusion isn't true. Whereas philosophy actively encourages that because we have this kind of robust practice of, at its best, really encouraging and fostering disagreement. I think it can be an amazing way to empower people who historically would be, yeah, a little bit socially on the outs if they just said, no, I think this is false. And it can actually create a space where that is completely possible and encouraged and socially sanctioned. Now, again, it's kind of a double-edged sword because that also means that philosophy can be a difficult practice for historically excluded people who need to feel and actually be supported to feel comfortable doing that kind of robust disagreeing and directly challenging authority figures, including, old dead white guys like Plato and Aristotle. But when people really do get into the spirit of anyone can be challenged, again, for almost any reason, bearing in mind there are cases where it would be, I do think, horrible to challenge certain views that come directly from people's humanity or lived experience. But absent that, you kind of get to think what you want. And that is a liberating practice. So these parts of philosophy that are good and bad, they're not really separable. There's both room for someone to say that's false in a domineering spirit, which, given the overall context and the other things that they say and the overall power dynamics and the overall rhetoric they use, can establish this sense that, like, oh, you can't contradict blah, blah, blah's view about blah, blah, blah. That's just, the correct view. But it can also lead to a situation where, people who are even like quite low down, pernicious social hierarchies get to say that's false to the most socially powerful people. And they might well be right if they're sufficiently thoughtful and reasoning well. And yeah, I think that's just super cool and powerful. And it's both like a cool thing that happens using reasoning, but it's also a cool thing that happens socially to watch a student who maybe hasn't been empowered because of aspects of their social position begin to see that their contributions, in direct contradiction to authority figures, including unwittingly mine in the classroom, that those are really welcome and valued and delighted in, even as part of that ongoing dialectic.
Okay, great. We have to leave it there, but thanks very much for participating in this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. I appreciate it. I'm sure my Ukrainian colleagues do too. Again, I want to encourage everyone who's watching and attending to contribute what you can to this initiative. Yeah, thanks very much, Kate. I appreciate your time, and I'm very happy to have you here.
Thanks so much, Aaron. And yes, please donate generously. It's a very worthy cause.
Great. Thank you. So thanks everyone for attending What Good is Philosophy, a benefit conference for Ukraine. My name is Aaron Wendland. I'm Vision Fellow in Public Philosophy at King's College London and the host of this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. This benefit event is designed to raise funds for a Center for Civic Engagement in Ukraine, and this center is designed to provide support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine in their time of need. So any and every contribution makes a difference, and after the talks, we're going to give you an opportunity to make a donation. That said, it's my great pleasure to welcome Barry Lamb. Barry Lamb is professor of philosophy at UC Riverside and visiting professor of philosophy at Princeton University. He is the founding host and producer of the Hi-Fi Nation podcast, a show that blends philosophy with stories from everyday life, current events, science, and culture. Hi-Fi Nation is on Slate network of podcasts and is currently in its 6th season of production. Barry is going to be talking to us today about discretion. He's giving us a philosophical analysis of the power of bureaucrats. Barry, thanks for coming and for participating in this benefit event for Ukraine. Over to you.
Thank you, Aaron. Very happy to be here. Well, the theme is what good is philosophy? And I think one of the good things about philosophy is that it's always concerned itself with justice and the best way to live together in a society. You see it in the writings of Plato and the earliest works of Confucius in China 100 years before Plato. It doesn't matter if you count yourself in the Western or Eastern traditions, in the Northern or Southern traditions. There's always seemed to be actual and hypothetical conflicts that arise when humans have to live together in the same land, the same world, when they need to use the same resources. And as soon as civilizations got big enough so that you started living with strangers, not just family and extended family, you get philosophers who started thinking about how one person or one peoples can justly and unjustly exercise power over another. And they do this because the answers aren't obvious. We have very strong emotions that drive us to think in certain ways. We know that human nature is complex, but we know that some things are true quite generally. We have strong inclinations to be partial to people we love, people we're related to, and people we know. And we have strong inclinations to believe that whatever it is that makes ourselves look best. And you put that together in a society of strangers, and you'll have very strong opinions and emotions that the right answers to a question is one way, and equally strong opinions and emotions that the right answer is another way. So you can't just rely on the strong opinions and emotions of a populace because they'll disagree. Then the good thing about philosophy is what it's supposed to be good at is to try and address these questions in a way that don't simply appeal to our natural inclinations. It's to try and see if our natural inclinations can be challenged in a way that perhaps convinces us ourselves that we should go against them in some particular cases. And that often happens. It doesn't always happen. Maybe it doesn't happen enough, but there's a hope in philosophy that justice is as much connected to reason and evidence as it is to natural human inclinations. And with the right balance, hopefully we can achieve both. We can balance both and achieve justice. And today I want to I use a case study of one such question and how philosophy can help us think through this issue. And the issue is the problem of discretion. Discretion is the ability of people who are in charge of making and enforcing rules to ignore the rule or law, or to make an exception for an individual. So here's an example. A police officer sees someone breaking a law, but rather than arrest them and take them to jail, the police officer gives them a warning or otherwise tell them to do something else, go somewhere. Another example from the law is when someone breaks a particular law, but the prosecutor doesn't prosecute them, right? Instead offers to give them their freedom in exchange for information that will help them with another case. And a final example in that same arena is like a judge who has to decide on a particular case what to sentence someone, and the law says 25 years, right? And the judge might give them 10, or a judge might give them 50. And if judges have full discretion in a justice system, you might get two different judges in two different places, one giving someone 10 and one giving someone 50, or maybe no time at all. Just one final example, which hits a little close to home for Ukrainians at the moment, are border guards. At any border crossing, guards are supposed to be enforcing a law, right? But they have a lot of discretion, right? They end up letting some people through without checking this, that, or the other. Discretion is not just limited to a legal system of a country. Like in any organization, whether it's a university or hospital or any bureaucracy, you're going to have people in charge and people who make or write rules, and then people who go out and enforce those rules. Or they use the rules to determine how to interact with the person. So a hospital might have a rule that says no mammograms before the age of, for people younger than 40, right? Some hospitals might have that rule, no exceptions. And other hospitals might say, but we have the rule, but doctors can use their discretion in particular cases. And there's a general question we can ask about this kind of practice, whether it's a good way or a bad way to run a country, a good way or bad way to run a justice system or a hospital or any other kind of organization. And you can answer this question like a scientist, or you can answer this question like a philosopher. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both. If you're a philosopher, if you're a scientist, what you want is you want to compare two different countries or two different justice systems or two different hospitals, one where the people who run it have a lot of discretion and one where people have very little. And then you're going to try to compare which one is run better. And the answer to that question, is discretion good or bad when looked at scientifically, actually looks very mixed, right? There's one thing we know that happens in all cases when there's a lot of discretion, which is that disparities are wider. There's a lot more inequality in the way people are treated in the system. So you kind of expect that, right? With a lot of discretion, you'll get some judges who will give 10 years and others will get 50. With a lot of discretion, you're going to have doctors treating some patients in one way and other patients in another way. Kind of a given. And then a good thing that happens when discretion happens is that people are treated more like individuals, right? So for instance, if someone is stealing because they're hungry, that's different from someone who's stealing because they've got a business selling stolen goods. And a judge can use their discretion to treat those people differently when the situation is warranted. In cases like that, we might not even think that that's a disparity. We might think that's right. We want the people who are looking at individuals to treat the individuals according to the characteristics that individual displays, right? We want doctors to treat individuals. We don't want doctors to go by the book only. And what we mean by that is there's actually a standardized rule that says if a patient comes in, this, do X, do Y, do Z. Now, the reason the evidence is so mixed about whether discretion is good or bad is because decisions are made by people in cultures and countries. And there's a lot of differences in cultures and countries, right? Some cultures and countries value honor a whole lot. Others value cleverness. Some countries are more corrupt in that people take bribes. In other countries, there's very little bribes. And in the end, that's what makes the data so mixed. Which brings us to how a philosopher might treat an issue like this, right? A philosopher looks at the question as a whole. Is discretion good? Right. Sorry. The philosopher looks at a system as a whole, right? Let's look at a system in which there is discretion and a system in which there isn't much discretion, and ask, do I see some inherent injustices built into a system? Like, regardless of whether the results end up good or bad, what do I see in cases? And I want to talk a little bit now about what philosophers have said about this particular issue. And the first thought comes from the liberal Western democratic tradition, the one that goes all the way back to the Enlightenment, that leads to what we might think of as parliamentary democracy, voting, lawmaking, things like that. There's been a lot of hostility to discretion. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, discretion threatens a sacred value of liberal Western democracies, which is the rule of law, right? And the rule of law is the view that what you can or can't do, what qualifies you or prohibits you from a benefit should be explicitly written somewhere. And that writing has the authority, right? Individuals should be able to predict on the basis of that writing how they will be treated and how they ought to treat others. That treatment is fair and equal to all citizens and perfectly predictable, right? You don't think, well, I might come across this kind of person and they'll make an exception. Discretion definitely threatens that. The other objection is that discretion threatens democracy, right? The laws in a society, in a democracy, are, or at least ought to be treated as a reflection of the popular will. In some cases, they are the popular will when people vote directly for the law. And the idea that you would give an enforcer or a bureaucrat the power not to enforce a law that is the popular will is a threat to the idea that you have rule by popular will. It looks like enforcers and bureaucrats have the ability to bypass democracy altogether, right? And that means that you could have a society where their private will replaces the popular will, and that's the objection. So within this tradition, the view is that discretion is a necessary evil, but it's an evil. It's necessary only because of the imperfections of humanity, right? So discretion exists because humans are imperfect formulators of law, right? We can't come up with precise enough language and rules. So you might formulate a law that says, don't bother people with noises too loud after 10 p.m., right? But the law doesn't specify what is too loud, right? I suppose the law now can give you some kind of decibel meter that you measure everywhere. But in general, the way the laws are formulated generally says something like, oh, if it's too loud. But that too loud means that it gives discretion to an officer or a judge about, well, I think it's too loud. And so they have some discretion. But that's only a necessary evil. It's not something that if we have the means to do away with it, we should. And that's the view from Western liberal tradition. I want to talk about objections from a different tradition, though, the ancient Chinese tradition. This is called Chinese legalism. It's a view that comes from a philosopher named Han Feizi in about 200 BC. And it arose in the context of trying to unite China, ancient China, in different kingdoms and societies into one country, something that is a constant a theme in Chinese political philosophy. And according to Han Feizi, this is why discretion is bad. We ultimately all want a society that's well run. And we can't depend on the identity of individuals to ensure that the society is well run. That is, we can't depend on whether the leaders are good people or bad people, whether the bureaucrats are good people or bad people. Because in the end, and this is a view that he had about people, most of us are just mediocre, and most leaders are going to be mediocre. And maybe you'll get some good people some of the time, but then you'll get like some bad people some other times. The society that's well run can't depend on who's inhabiting the role of governing. It has to depend on the kind of rules that are in place so that whoever you put into the role of the governing, well, you can ensure that the society will be run in that way because the rules are in place and it doesn't depend on the person. So according to Han Feizi, the right way to run a society is to come up with as many rules as you know of that everybody has to follow, including the rulers. The rulers themselves will have job descriptions and titles, and those come with like a very strict set of rules of things they can do and things they can't do. And just like the punishments and rewards they're imposing on others in the society, they get punishments and rewards imposed on them, depending on whether they violate the rule or not. And so the view is that we all want to be in a legalistic society so that the society doesn't depend on good people, good decisions, or bad decisions. The laws make all of those decisions. Two very different traditions, same kind of result, highly suspicious of discretion. So I want to close the talk with a little bit of a discussion about why I think, as a philosopher, that all of these reasons for having a legalistic society, even if we can technologically implement it, might be a bad thing rather than a good thing, right? The first thing I want to say is that this march towards legalism or having rules without discretion is actually bad for the people who are being governed, right? The citizens of the society. And I want to use an example from the home, the household. So I have a daughter. My daughter is 10 years old. And my daughter's job is to empty out the dishwasher. You might even say that the chores constitute the rules of the household. Dad does this, mom does this, Darcy does this. At first, that's a pretty legitimate rule. And if she empties out the dishwasher, she gets an allowance. That's her reward. If she doesn't, the allowance gets taken away. That's the punishment. But I happen to have an arguer, right? And so sometimes she doesn't empty out the dishwasher. And I say, we're going to dock your allowance. And she replies with, well, I was going to do it eventually, right? Your rule doesn't say how long after the dishwasher is run that I have to put the dishes away. And so we revised the rule. Darcy's to empty out the dishwasher within 5 hours of completing the cycle, to which the reply sometimes when it's not done, well, what if I'm at school? Do you run it overnight? Or what if I have something else going on? And then the other thing that happens is that sometimes she starts and she gets distracted and she ends up playing video games for a couple of hours, and the dishwasher isn't empty. And to which I say, you didn't follow the rule. And she says, well, the rule doesn't say how long I have to do it. I mean, I'll eventually finish it. Eventually, this kind of discussion can lead a couple of places. One way it can lead is for me to develop a rule that looks like this. Darcy must empty out the dishwasher within 5 hours of the completion of the cycle. Once she starts, she has to complete within 10 minutes, unless she has something else like Girl Scouts or school, in which case she gets a 2-hour window, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Why am I describing this at home, this kind of thing that happens? Because this is the kind of thing that happens in a society. Right? We're all familiar with bureaucracies, not just government bureaucracies, but banks, hospitals, with rules that have 7 paragraphs, 28 subclauses for every last exception. As predictable as we want the rule of law to be, none of us read these things. We just don't. And if I ran my household this way, if I ended up having for every rule a list of all of the exceptions, I think a lot of people would say that I failed as a parent, right? That is not a way to run a household, whether with your family or with roommates or anybody else. And the reason why you failed is that your child has failed as a member of the family to understand why the rule was there in the first place and to develop a judgment for themselves as to when they should be following the rule and when there should be an exception, right? The rule is there because in order to live in a family, we have to have clean dishes. In order for there to be clean, mom to put the dirty dishes in the dishwasher, it's got to be empty, et cetera, et cetera. Failure to cultivate discretionary judgment in people is a result of having a society run solely on the basis of legalistic rules that apply blindly to everyone. We don't want that, right? Maybe some people will still develop it, But we want people to act for the right reasons. We don't want them to act solely on the basis of legal reasons, where the reason why they act is because they'll get in trouble with the law if they don't act that way. Now, I want to generalize that in the last few minutes to the people who rule us: prosecutors, judges, police, managers, bureaucrats. In the real world, we know that rules leave some area of discretion open because of the way we formulate rules are imperfect at the moment. So when people make decisions like that, like when an officer makes a decision about whether somebody's stereo is too loud at 10 p.m., we want them to exercise wise judgment about that, right? We don't want them to exercise only legal judgment. So for instance, even if they had a decibel meter and the decibel meter passed a particular threshold, we want an officer to think about, is this a threat in this circumstance? Is it New Year's Eve? Is this a person's party, right? Is the right thing to do in this circumstance to tell them to turn it off, or to tell them to, you have another 30 minutes, or to tell them to, actually, it's fine tonight. I don't think it's that bad. We want people to have extra legal reasons for action, moral reasons or practical reasons or other kinds of reasons as they go and interact with each other in the society. And we want that with police, prosecutors, judges, the people who are in charge, right? So ultimately, I think what I want to argue is that there's something objectionable about someone who acts solely for legal reasons. And the march to legalism, the march to have no discretion in the society, is the march to think that a society in which people act only for legal reasons, only because they will get in trouble with the law, they will be arrested or fined, is a bad society, right? And that's true even if the law were wholly morally good and defensible, and we want the laws to be there. What we want ultimately is a society when people interact with each other as people, and the moral considerations that people give to each other are right. We give moral consideration, not just legal considerations about each other. So that's it. That's my talk. Thank you, Aaron, for having me.
Yeah, thanks very much, Barry. I really appreciate you coming on and participating in this benefit event. I really enjoyed your talk. And I guess I have a few questions that we can get to. The first maybe takes it sort of one step up in terms of level of generality from bureaucrats, and just to, instead of the laws that bureaucrats are following, something like principles of justice, since you began the talk with discussions of sort of justice in states aiming at them. And the question kind of is built around the idea of, let's say, humans are imperfect at formulating the law. And part of me wants to think that maybe this is not why we have discretion, because we're imperfect at formulating the law, but rather there's always a gap between whatever the law or principle is and practical affairs. So there's like a distinction to be made between generality and particularity, that laws are these general, slightly more abstract things from everyday affairs. They're principles, but they don't always correspond to particular events. And so there needs to be a gap between the law, and that's what discretion fills, that the gap between sort of like the general nature of law and then the particular instances it's always applied to. And these particular instances may require discretion because there's no identical match between principles or abstract laws and then the particular circumstances they have been applied to. And so I wonder, this might be the reason for discretion, is that laws don't actually always fit particular circumstances. And I just wonder what you sort of think about the relationship between law or principles and then particular circumstances. And this might be a reason for discretion, independent of having independent reasons for action outside of the law.
I think that what you're describing is actually a good way to try to think about law. A good way to think about law is that we should formulate law as general principles and rely on the discretion of individual actors. I think that that's the kind of thing that I was arguing for.
Okay.
But I think that what in fact happens is what I'm calling the march to legalism, the march to Byzantium. What happens is laws get increasingly Byzantine. and they have become increasingly Byzantine as a society evolves. I think there's just generally one direction things hold, which is that you start having very general laws, and then they start being like, let me give you an example. Here's a general law: don't have dangerous guns, right? That's true of a lot of countries. It's not true of my country. But they tried to, in the latest version of the law, where they were trying to prohibit guns from dangerous people, one thing you can do is prohibit guns from dangerous people. Judges and police officers have discretion over that. But that's not how it was formulated. Instead, you had 2 pages, 7 paragraphs trying to define what a boyfriend was. Because it was like, if you were a boyfriend or a domestic, whatever, that had a previous, arrest, then you don't get a gun. But then they were just did not trust judges to have the discretion. And so what the law ended up being was, you are a boyfriend if blah, blah. They have to define how long you had to have dated, in what capacity. And then like very complex. That's actually the law, Aaron, right? So I like the idea, but the way that we've been headed is the opposite, right? The claim was that we're trying to remove discretion from the individual actors by making the laws increasingly Byzantine, just so that we don't have to rely on judges. So the approach has been discretion, necessary evil, but like, let's try to, chop away at it.
Okay, interesting. Maybe one quick question, which is sort of even going back further to sort of just the relationship between reason and philosophy, and the sort of battle between reason and evidence when coming up with public policy, and then emotion and attachment and bias that you talked about sort of at the beginning. And I guess the idea I have here is if philosophy is dealing in sort of reason, law, principles, what is there needs to be exceptions to philosophy, or if we subscribe to philosophy, there needs to be discretion or limits to philosophy, limits to what it can do in terms of human thinking about human action, thinking about good, thinking about ethical behavior for humans. There's a limit to what philosophy can do insofar as it trades in reason. This is what I'm getting, that there needs to be discretion even for philosophy itself.
I think that natural human inclination should not be written off. I don't think justice should be administered according to natural human inclination, but I also don't think it should be administered purely on the basis of abstractly arrived at principles through solely reason and evidence. We need to take into consideration that people get incredibly angry at a certain kind of scenario. And even if we think that has to happen, that reaction should be a consideration for us.
Right. Okay. Great. Barry, thanks so much for participating in this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. Also, thanks to all the listeners. Again, I encourage you to contribute to this initiative. We're going to put something up on the screen so you have all the relevant information to make this contribution. And again, Barry, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch. Thanks everyone for attending this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis. And the conference is meant to generate support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine. I encourage everyone who's attending to contribute what they can, and I appreciate your participation in this entire benefit event. That said, it's my pleasure to introduce David Enoch. David is the Rodney Blackman Chair in the Philosophy of Law and the Philosophy Department and the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is the author of Taking Morality Seriously, A Defense of Robust Realism, as well as a host of scholarly articles, including Against Public Reason in Oxford Studies in Political Philosophy, and False Consciousness for Liberals in Philosophical Review. He also regularly weighs into political debates by writing op-eds in the Israeli press. David is going to be talking to us today about what good is political philosophy in the face of an acute political crisis. David, thanks very much for participating in this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. I appreciate it, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks for inviting me. When applying to graduate schools in philosophy, one often has to write what is called a personal statement, something explaining one's interest in philosophy, the topics one is most interested in, perhaps some thoughts about one's future in the field. When I wrote mine, this is now over 25 years ago, I'm afraid, I already knew I wanted to defend morality's objectivity, perhaps to defend morality. But in that statement, I expressed this intention with a feeling of moral urgency. It didn't just seem to me philosophically important to defend morality's objectivity. It seemed to me important to do so. I even gave a personal example, as one is sometimes encouraged to do in such personal statements, noting that I refused to serve in the occupied territories and even spent a few weeks in military jail because of this. Surely, if morality is significant enough to call on me to do that, it must be objective. Defending morality's objectivity seemed to me back then morally important. And I have to say it still does, though perhaps to a lesser extent. As far as I can remember, this really was a long time ago, I don't think I was too naive or arrogant then. I realized that other things are, of course, more morally important. But philosophy too, specifically metaethics, the part of philosophy that deals, among other things, with questions about the metaphysical and epistemological status of morality, seemed to me morally important. And I think a part of the reason for this was political. It seemed to me that securing morality's objectivity was relevant to political philosophy, and indeed to politics. I used to tell people that this is how all philosophy is relevant practically. Political philosophy is practically relevant. Metaethics is relevant to political philosophy. And all of philosophy, the philosophy of language, the weirdest parts of metaphysics, everything is relevant to metaethics. POED. Was this mere philosophical and maybe also political naivete on my side, as philosophizing is not, after all, politically significant? Or is there something true about all that? Something true and deep about the moral urgency of doing philosophy? Something that it's perhaps easy to lose sight of as one worries more about preparing classes, publishing professional papers, doing administrative work. Now, the worry that philosophy, perhaps in spite of its other advantages, perhaps precisely because of them, the worry that philosophy is not practically relevant has been with us for a while. And many philosophers, I think, are rather indifferent to it. The value of doing, say, aesthetics or the philosophy of mathematics does not depend, many philosophers will rightly insist, on its practical relevance, whatever exactly practical relevance means here. But when it comes to political philosophy, we get more nervous. I mean, perhaps there's the same kind of pure intellectual value in doing political philosophy as there is in doing philosophy of mind, say, or in studying the history of philosophy. But still, shouldn't political philosophy be at least somewhat relevant to, well, politics. Now, this thought is not grounded merely in the fact that political philosophy is about politics. The philosophy of science is about science, but this doesn't mean it has to be relevant to the practice of scientists. And if it isn't, this is no criticism of the philosophy of science, I think. The situation when it comes to political philosophy is different because political philosophy, at least in part, is also normative. Political philosophers often have things to say about the just way of distributing resources, or how decisions ought to be made in a complicated collective, or what the limits of justified criminalization are, or what the conditions are for state legitimacy. When discussing such normative questions about politics, the concerns of political philosophers seem to be continuous with those of actors on the political stage. Indeed, I think that if a discussion in normative political philosophy strays too far from the concerns that are shared also by political activists, this is often, though perhaps not necessarily, an indication that something in the philosophical discussion has gone wrong. Times of crisis, as in the Ukraine now, or in a different way in my own country as well, raise this challenge in an especially acute way. For in such times, political actors have even less time and patience for philosophy than usual. Such times, it is often emphasized, are times for action, not for hesitation. The setting of a seminar room, the one we all know and love, where we feel most comfortable to philosophize, where we can take our time in thinking about deep problems, that setting seems so very different, not just from that of the street on which invading forces are being fought, but also from that of cabinet offices, where decisions are actually being made under terrible time pressure, with limited information, with unbelievably high stakes. Even if a moral or philosophical question comes up, say whether the drastic times justify a specific kind of problematic drastic measure, the thought of a Socrates responding with, but what is justice? That thought just seems ludicrous. Again, it's not as if philosophers or philosophizing are very welcome in cabinet meetings in more normal times. Perhaps this is partly because philosophers are better, it seems, in thinking about things in general and in abstraction, whereas political decisions are always particular and concrete. But perhaps sometimes we can say, raise a question that others have missed, or point out a consideration worth taking into account. Perhaps we can offer a more general perspective. At a time of crisis, there is no time for this. It's time to act. That their philosophy is of no use to political actors in times of crisis may not be too big a deal for metaphysicians, or philosophers of language, or those studying Muslim philosophy in the Middle Ages. And perhaps it should not bother those of us doing political philosophy much more. But it does. At least I worry. True, people are not right now that much into listening at a time of crisis. But shouldn't we have something to say, at least to those who may listen? Isn't it a failure of sorts for political philosophy if at times of crisis, like the proverbial muses when the cannons are heard, it must be silent? I don't think it would be a devastating blow to political philosophy if at times of crisis it has little to say, but it would be a blow nonetheless. And so I want to try and see whether more can nevertheless be said here. What good are political philosophers at a time of crisis? An initial distinction that I think is relevant here is between all the ways in which philosophers, political or otherwise, may be of some use at the time of crisis, and ways in which they may be of use in particular in their capacity as philosophers. For at times of crisis, and at other times too, but especially at times of crisis, philosophers can and should do all the things conscientious citizens in general do, regardless of their occupation or academic discipline, if any. They should fight, as it were, shoulder to shoulder with their fellow citizens for everything that is right and good. They should fight oppression and occupiers. They should speak up for those who have no voice. And yes, they should also give money for the right purposes. So this is a good time to remind you of what Aaron said at the beginning, and also will say at the end of the talk. He'll give you the details of how to contribute to the causes to which this conference is dedicated. But that the duties that apply to everyone at the time of crisis apply also to those who happen to be philosophers. This, I take it, is uncontroversial. But it is not entirely uninteresting. For some of these duties that apply to everyone may apply to people in a way that's sensitive to their circumstances. And philosophers, perhaps academics more generally, may be relevantly better placed than others, and so may have stricter duties. So I want to give a few examples of this. For example, then, academics, especially those like philosophers who primarily work with words, may have an easier time getting op-ed pieces published in the media. Now, as I said, everyone has a duty to speak, sometimes even shout for justice. But if it's easier for some to get their shouts published than for others, then they have a weightier duty to do so. The ability to get one's words published is a kind of power. It is not perhaps the strongest or most impressive kind of power, but it is a kind of power nonetheless, and it is one that we do often have. So we have a duty to use it, and indeed to use it well. Also, often academics have more international connections than the average citizen. If so, and if appeals to the international community are of significance, as they often are, then this is a duty that applies more to academics than to others. Lastly, in some places, many philosophers have tenure. This sounds like it's terribly down to earth, but I actually think it's important. In my country, for instance, speaking up against the occupation, against the government, against the anti-democratic measures that it puts in place as we speak, speaking up in such ways is starting to become risky for many. But at least right now, tenured academics still have the kind of job security most people can only hope for. This means, of course, that those of us who have this privilege also have the weightier duty to use it for the good. The usual duties that apply to all then apply to philosophers as well, sometimes in ways that are sensitive to the specific circumstances of philosophers, or anyway, of some philosophers. But the more interesting question is whether philosophers can contribute, as it were, as philosophers. And here, things are less clear, I think. My own academic appointment is split between a philosophy department and the faculty of law. And I think we can learn here something from the role that legal academics, and indeed lawyers, sometimes play. Sometimes legal academics take part in supplying a kind of legal support for activists. I think they realize that it's not their work that will be primarily important. They, or at least the ones I want to focus on here, the ones I want to learn from here, are not on the front lines of the struggle. But they play an important supportive role, supplying those in the front line with legal arguments, legal defenses, legal representation. Actually, in the current crisis in Israel, the role of legal academics in the struggle is more central, with some being very much in the front line. But this is because of the legal and constitutional nature of the specific crisis in Israel. I don't think it's in general the case. One central way in which political philosophers may be of help during a political crisis, I want to tentatively suggest, is by supplying the analog of such legal support. So no, philosophers will not be on the front line, and if they are, they will not typically be there as philosophers. But we can support those on the front lines by supplying them with philosophical defenses and argumentation. That we can do, and furthermore, we can do that as philosophers. There is a problem, though. Many politically important issues are not philosophically profound. You don't need a PhD in philosophy in order to realize that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is criminal and also unjust. Much less do you need a philosophical training in order to be morally clear on some of the atrocities involved in this invasion. Those who think otherwise, or who convince themselves otherwise, or who don't care, are guilty of a number of flaws. But lack of philosophical education or sophistication need not be one of them. So this is not where philosophers have a relative advantage. It's just that injustice rarely comes bare. More often it is clothed in words, in texts, in manipulative arguments, in pseudo-justifications. And sometimes these pseudo-justifications are reasonably well done. That is, sometimes it's not entirely trivial to dismantle them, to show just how pseudo they really are. And this is where we may have an advantage as philosophers. For there is really nothing we are better at than being negative, than engaging in what can be called bullshit busting, and arguably, there's no one better than us at it. Also, and this contributes to us being good at it, many of us quite like such bullshit busting. It is here then that we should use our powers for the good. And when the bullshit is political, it is primarily us political philosophers who have this bullshit busting duty. We should, in other words, supply those doing the real work with a kind of philosophical support that ensures that they can focus on what's of primary importance at the time of crisis. If an argument comes along, say, about historical territorial rights, or about nationalism, or about what democracy really is and why it is justified, that is flawed and manipulative and intended to throw those on the front line off guard, we should step in and expose it for what it is. Now, I fully understand that this picture, here's the picture I'm painting. The good guys are fighting the bad guys shoot an arrow poisoned with bad argumentation at the good guys, and the philosopher jumps in front of the fighting good guys to block the arrow. Right? That picture sounds ridiculously heroic. I understand that. Even the analogous legal picture, where the bad guys shoot a legally poisoned arrow and the lawyers step in to block it, even that picture seems less ridiculous than the one I painted quickly. But this may just be a matter of degree. Yes, we should not overstate our significance at the time of crisis. We are not, anyway, not in our capacity as philosophers, in any way the central figures in this play. But this doesn't mean we don't have any role to play. You may think, and I'm really not sure about this, that the kind of bullshit busting role I've been suggesting we may play at the time of crisis is nicely continuous with the role, or anyway, a central role, of philosophers at other times as well. Much of our work, after all, is quite negative. Indeed, at least when it comes to political philosophy, much of my own work is quite negative. Which brings me back to the relevance of metaethics to political philosophy. I'm not sure that you need to do a lot of metaethics in order to defend a plausible political philosophy. And I'm almost entirely sure that you don't have to do metaethics, or indeed any philosophy at all, in order to recognize some of the most egregious injustices around you and to fight them. But I do think that some conceptions of liberalism, both in the public intellectual environment and among philosophers, indeed even the most dominant kind of liberalism in political philosophy, many such conceptions of liberalism are often guilty of taking for granted indefensible metaethical theses in the vicinity of moral relativism. The conception of the liberal, I'm here paraphrasing Frost's nice way of putting things, the conception of the liberal as someone too broad-minded to take their own side in an argument. That conception, even if it is aptly deserved by some liberals, is still a misconception. And it is important to do some metaethical bullshit busting en route to a more defensible, politically robust kind of liberalism. In some of my work, I've been trying to do just that. So if you're not into this kind of political philosophy, feel free to tune out for a few sentences. I'm going to let you know when to tune back in again. In this spirit, I think that the quite dominant Rawlsian version of liberalism, sometimes called political liberalism, with its emphasis on disagreement, on the need to base everything on matters that enjoy a so-called overlapping consensus, with its pretense that there is an epistemically and politically significant distinction between the reasonable and the unreasonable, with some sort of epistemic notion of the burdens of judgment. I think that this kind of liberalism is both intellectually indefensible and politically unwise, maybe even politically dangerous. It places the liberal in the Faustian position of not being able to defend their own side in an argument. And I think that we should sometimes do metaethics and sometimes other kinds of philosophy in order to break free of some of these mistakes and offer a non-bullshit, keep your eye on the ball kind of liberalism that is both intellectually defensible and less politically impotent. Okay, back to the main line. So this is where you should tune back in if you did tune out. Although I hope to continue doing some such work, this, of course, is a matter for other times, perhaps times which are to a lesser extent times of pressing crises, if such times exist. For now, I just want to note that if this kind of work is quite central for political philosophers in general, then the kind of bullshit busting, perhaps especially called for at times of crisis, is pleasingly continuous with one of our major roles at other times as well. Still, you may be disappointed. Even if this is a way in which political philosophers may actually make a difference at a time of crisis, it may be less than you've hoped for. And I want to immediately concede that it's not much. Before concluding, though, I want to make 2 points. One about modesty, and one about another much vaguer way in which political philosophers may make a difference at a time of crisis. First, then, modesty. I don't mean here modesty as a personal virtue exactly, but more as something about the discipline, or at least about the sociology of the field. There is something inherently arrogant about doing philosophy. We are out there to solve great mysteries, to answer the deepest questions. Often these are questions that philosophers and others have been asking for thousands of years. The thought that I may actually make progress on some of these deepest philosophical problems involves, as a matter of necessity, the unbelievable thought that I may succeed where all the great dead philosophers have failed. When I introduce first-year students to a philosophical problem, and before we even begin the more serious discussion, one of them wants to suggest a solution, this may be in some ways admirable. And for instrumental reasons, we should probably encourage such ambition in our students. But on another level, the thought that she or he may have the solution up their sleeve, a solution that somehow has eluded all of us for centuries, that thought is just ridiculous. And it's not clear that in this respect, any of us is different from this first-year student. So realizing that our discipline's practical value at times of crisis is really quite minimal may be painfully sobering. But it may also be, in a way, liberating. Sure, we should try our best now as always to make progress on philosophical problems, big or small. But let's not forget our real science, as it were. This may be especially liberating for political philosophers, who sometimes write as if the entire world awaits our verdicts. Had this been so, had things we write been extremely influential in the real world, this would have placed constraints on what we can responsibly say. For the most part, though, people don't care so much about what we write. Certainly people in positions of power don't. We don't make that much of a difference. So we might as well write the truth. Perhaps this modesty, together with the urgency in times of acute crisis, may even foster a kind of camaraderie among bullshit-busting philosophers. A camaraderie that, like modesty, doesn't always characterize our discipline. The one good thing about the current crisis in Israel is that I've seen a group of legal academics working together in, for the most part, egoless, creditless ways that are not our usual modus operandi. Perhaps this can be hoped for among philosophers as well. Perhaps, for instance, we can in this way better appreciate the significance of very small philosophical steps that only make a more major philosophical difference when put together. Perhaps we can in this way learn to care less, at least a little bit less, about ego and about credit. I want to conclude with another role that political philosophers may play. In the heat of battle, an actual battle, as is the case in the Ukraine, or a constitutional battle over the very foundations of anything resembling a democracy, as in Israel these days, in the heat of such battles, it is very hard to also look further than the current battle. Everything is on fire, as it were, and all the efforts are now made to put it out. It is easy to forget that politics need not be this way. Political philosophers can perhaps help by standing their ground, by refusing to give in. Of course, political philosophers should fight shoulder to shoulder with their fellow citizens and activists for everything that is right and good. And they may be required to do some extra bullshit busting for the cause. But they can perhaps also try to serve as a reminder for what political discussion in better times can be like. Perhaps, I'm really not sure about this. Perhaps in this way, political philosophers and other philosophers too can help in inspiring some hope.
Thank you, David. That was great. I really appreciate your talk, and I appreciate the support you're providing for the Ukrainian Academy by participating in this event. If you don't mind, I'll follow up maybe with a couple quick questions. I was somewhat surprised to say, to hear you say at the beginning, right, that it was clear that you needed to sort out some of these meta-ethical issues, and your desire to sort out these meta-ethical issues were directly connected to the political issues you saw around you, that you needed the right sort of answers. And then later in the talk, you kind of suggested that meta-ethics may not be quite so important to political philosophy, and indeed to what you call bullshit busting. So I guess just in your own case, right, I maybe you can give us an example of sort of the bullshit busting. I could imagine something like counter propaganda that political philosophers might engage in, and how that nevertheless connects to sort of your meta-ethical views. Like, are you drawing, if you yourself are engaging in this bullshit busting, how do you draw on your meta-ethical commitments and your more abstract and general commitments? And maybe if you can give us an example of how this works, because it seems like at the beginning it was clear that there was a direct line between these meta-ethical commitments and political action. And then you were suggesting maybe we can set those aside and still just engage in this bullshit busting. So I guess in your case, when you're doing this work, could you just tell us how you see this all hanging together? And maybe give us an example if you have one.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you two examples.
Okay, perfect.
Both relevant to the crisis in Israel right now. One has to do with the conception of democracy, and furthermore with the justification of democracy. And some people, perhaps the more sophisticated, on the side supporting these anti-democratic measures and reforms, constitutional reforms, will sometimes put forward a purely procedural conception of democracy, and will sometimes attempt to support it by something resembling a really simplistic kind of moral relativism. So we can't rely on anything substantive. So all we have is one person, one vote, and the majority rule, and that's it. And whereas on the other side, some of us will insist that if democracy is justified, then there must be more to it than that. It rests on substantive values, perhaps something about equality, perhaps something about dignity, perhaps something about community, perhaps something about non-subordination, something along these lines. And these substantive values both have, of course, have a role to play in justifying majority rule to the extent that it's justified, but they also have other implications that cannot be compromised just for a majority, a temporary majority. Right? So when we insist on those values, we're doing political philosophy. And then if someone says, but there are no values, everything is relative or whatever, then you may need to do some meta-ethical bullshit busting. That's one kind of example.
Right.
Excuse me. Another one has to do with what I hope will become relevant. So, I mean, I hope that the circumstances will change, but seeing that they won't, I hope that resistance will partly engage in civil disobedience. And when people talk about civil disobedience, often the argument comes up, hey, if you think it's okay to engage in civil disobedience, to break the law for principled reasons as a part of your protest and resistance, then you must acknowledge that it's also justified when the other side engages in civil disobedience. Right? So there's a kind of symmetry going on. But that's another piece of bullshit that needs to be busted. There is no symmetry between truth and falsehood. There is no symmetry between those fighting for what is good and right and those fighting for what is not. Now, this is tricky because there are going to be some political contexts in which you may need such symmetry. For instance, if you want to be considerate of people's conscience, that may require some neutrality to the content of the conscience. But when you're trying to justify measures that are part of a struggle, there is no symmetry between right and wrong or between true and false. So that also requires some bullshit busting of this kind.
Okay, thanks very much. I have, I suppose, one other question. Maybe it's not a question, but I guess what you were saying in some ways resonates with my experience with what the work some of the philosophers are doing in Ukraine. That is, they've seen their role, and in some ways it dovetails with what this Center for Civic Engagement is about, is that they've precisely been, one of the initiatives that Kyiv Mohyla Academy is running is a a counter sort of propaganda initiative where the scholars are out there saying, Russians are saying this about Ukrainian history or this stuff, and this is just false. And so we're out there countering it. So I don't know if this is just dovetails, is that it doesn't even have to be meta-ethical, but there are ways that you could sort of just defend the truth in these circumstances.
And then which scholar is relevant will depend on what propaganda or what bullshit we're fighting. So if there's a point about history that's deeply manipulative and misleading, then we need the historians to come in. And I know that historians feel more comfortable in the seminar room or in their office or in the archives, but when such a moment comes up, that's their role. And clearly legal academics have such a role, and sometimes philosophers have such a role as well.
Yeah. Well, great. David, I really appreciate your time. I'm sure my Ukrainian colleagues do too. I'd like to thank everyone who's attending this benefit conference for your participation. I encourage everyone to contribute what they can to this initiative, and I'd like to thank David again for an excellent talk and for participating.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for attending this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis. The conference is meant to generate support for establishing a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and this center in turn will provide support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine who are doing excellent work in very challenging circumstances. After the talk, we'll put some information up on the screen, and we encourage everyone to contribute what they can to this initiative. With that said, it's my pleasure to introduce Peter Godfrey-Smith. Peter is Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney. He previously taught at Stanford, ANU, Harvard, and the CUNY Graduate Center. He has written 6 books, including Other Minds, The Octopus and the Evolution of Intelligent Life, and his most recent book, Metazoa, Animal Life and the Birth of the Mind. The title of Peter's talk is Philosophy and the Events of the Day. Peter, it's an honor to have you here, and over to you.
Thanks very much, and I'm very pleased to be part of this event. The topic of the conference is what good is philosophy, and we're asking that question in the context of the crisis prompted by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's natural to ask not just about the general role of philosophy, but the relationship between philosophy with its slow pace of change and other peculiarities, and fast developing events, especially crises that call for an intellectual response of some kind. So I'll say a little bit about the general role of philosophy as I see it in relation to the sciences and other parts of intellectual life, and then look at a couple of crises. The last time I did a What Good is Philosophy talk, it was at the New School in New York City, and it had a particular eye on the relation between philosophy of science. I'll put the text of that talk on my website. The view I outlined there was general, though, about philosophy in a broad sense. And there I talked about 3 roles for philosophy. These then became more complicated as the talk went on, but the roles themselves give us a start here. The first role I called an integrative role for philosophy. And this is basically in line with the famous quote from Wilfrid Sellars, when he said that philosophy is concerned with how things in the broadest possible sense of the term hang together in the broadest possible sense of the term. Philosophy aims at an overall picture of what the world is like and how we fit into it, where this includes integration of scientific information with informal common sense pictures of various kinds, and also integrative questions that are bigger than that, such as the relationship between fact and value. The second role for philosophy I recognized can be called an incubator role. Philosophy is a place where ideas are developed in a speculative and broad form in theory sketches and schemata that often then make their way into an empirical form within some science, or a mathematical form, or some other more focused form. A lot of people have noted this role or something like it. Karl Popper is one, responding in part to the very narrow view of philosophy seen in the Vienna Circle. Michael Friedman has recently looked closely at examples, including the history of ideas about space and geometry from the 19th into the early 20th century, and also the influence of Kant's dynamic conception of matter through German idealism and the poet Coleridge to Ørsted, Faraday, and other 19th century experimentalists. A number of developments in 20th century psychology and linguistics, I think, have the same character. Those 2 roles leave out something that's often seen as specific to analytic philosophy, the recent English-speaking tradition, and that's a set of skills and intellectual values, especially clarity and a certain kind of critical mindset. These are often seen as central to philosophy itself. I don't think that, but there is an important part of the role of a philosophy department in a modern university that I think does run along these lines. This is part of what philosophy contributes to education, especially undergraduate education. Philosophy also has a further educational role, which links to the others that I mentioned. Richard Rorty once made a comment, which I've not been able to track down in print, that I like. Rorty said that philosophy is the place in the university where a student can bring any two books from the library and put them on a desk and ask what, if anything, they have to do with each other. So as a first picture, I think that philosophy has three roles: integrative, incubator, and an educational role, especially in universities. Suppose now that we encounter a crisis of some kind and wonder what role philosophy might have. And here I mean, we don't just wonder what philosophers as humans might do, but wonder what they might do qua philosophers. Crises are fast-moving, and they tend to be very much a matter of specifics. One might wonder whether philosophy has a lot to do in a situation like that. We might distinguish a couple of possibilities. In some situations, philosophical ideas might be applied to a crisis. These will especially be ideas from political philosophy and value theory in many cases. And a crisis might also prompt new philosophical work by posing a problem in a new way. Now, those two will interact, and we might expect this. And we might expect also all of this to fall under the first of those broad roles that I mentioned, the integrative role. And that's basically what I think. Next, to illustrate this, I will spend some time on the role of philosophy in a particular recent crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. First, I must say that I think philosophy as a discipline did fairly badly during COVID. It did badly because it did so little. More specifically, there's a sector of philosophy, a part of the profession, that I think didn't do what it might ideally have done. And that's moral and political philosophy, especially within the top English-speaking universities. So I'm going to criticize that part of the profession, and to some extent, the profession more broadly. I do this without any enthusiasm or relish. I like the world of philosophy, its culture, its conferences, and so on. The what use is philosophy things I've written before now have been positive about philosophy. I'm not one of those philosophers who doesn't much like their own profession. I also suspect I might make a few people unhappy with the criticism in this talk, but I don't think there's much of a choice. I think the points have to be made. First, ought there to have been much of a philosophical response to COVID? Yes, I think, because it was a crisis that raised some problems of quite a general nature, which involved policy questions in interaction with others. Now, these played out differently in different countries, but many of them involved the following sorts of issues. Firstly, liberties, enforcement, and coercion, including the proper role of the police in a liberal society. The crisis also raised questions about how to weigh the interests of the old and the young, for example, in relation to school closures. The fact that COVID was so much more dangerous to older than younger people added a new element to the already difficult problems about the suspension of normal life. Thirdly, it was likely from the start that COVID measures popular in the West would exacerbate inequalities of several kinds. How does that go into the mix with the rest? Now, and when I say the mix there, that suggests the integrative role of philosophical theorizing. There's a lot here that in a somewhat novel way had to be made to fit together, to look back to the Sellers formula. So what did we get? Well, I hope some of what follows might be surprising to you. It's surprising to me, and I hope that I might be a bit wrong because I've missed things. But I'll go through some of what I know about as far as the philosophical response goes. And my focus will be on the policy issues, not the philosophy of science side. Some people worked on questions about models, for example, rather than what we should do, the crisis side, and I won't include them. I'm also going to focus on English-speaking countries. The picture is a bit different in Europe, and I'll say a word about that. But I'm talking about my philosophical world here. Okay, I'm going to put up a list. I'll do a brief screen share. The first group there on the left, philosophers, that one's made up of people with a professional presence in value theory, moral philosophy, and nearby fields. Peter Singer stands out. He wrote 2 articles I know about on lockdowns, 2 on vaccine mandates. Frances Cam wrote several pieces, including an especially good one in the Boston Review, where she opposed the simplest kinds of consequentialist reasoning about years of life lost, for example, under various policies, and outlined a more sophisticated view that prioritizes the worst off. Now, I didn't know about that framework, and I liked it. I was grateful to Cam for bringing it to bear on this problem. Ben Bramble wrote a book and more. Shamik Dasgupta wrote an article about school closures. Holly Lawford Smith wrote an article applying ideas from population ethics in the sense of Derek Parfit to the super strict Melbourne Australian lockdowns. Kieran Oberman wrote a paper about freedom and lockdowns. I'll say a bit about that below. And there are some other people on the first part of this list. After that, we get to a list of philosophers from other fields, including myself, Eric Winsberg, Jonathan Birch, Alex Broadbent, and others. Now, I'm not going to go through all the names, and I'm sure I've left people out of the list. I apologize to them in advance. And as I said, I've not tried to cover all of continental Europe, where we have Agamben and quite a lot of other people. I want to make a point about the profession of philosophy, especially value theory in English-speaking universities. I'll stop to share there. Singer and Cam are people who are on all the philosophy syllabi. They're parts of the furniture here. Most of the others don't have quite that role. Now, that's not a point about who is good, and I want to praise the people who brought more value theory knowledge to the discussion than people like me could. My concern is that all the other people who are part of the furniture in value theory, who would be on the syllabi, didn't write anything that I know of in many cases. I don't know what they think. I don't know what they think about prioritizing the interests of the young over the old. I don't know whether they think, like Singer, that vaccine mandates were reasonable, especially given the newness of the technology in the most widely used vaccines. I don't know especially what they think about basic freedoms and lockdowns, especially in the UK and Australia. Also, I think in Canada and France, a case might have been made for a kind of lexical priority, in a sense seen in Rawls and others, for some of the liberties suspended during lockdowns. Question of whether it's ever appropriate to use the police and the army in Australia to prevent people from visiting their extended families, for example, or their parents. I can imagine an argument that no crisis short of in-place warfare should do that. Or perhaps an argument that such suspensions are okay for a short time, that nearly any suspension is okay for a short time, but must be strictly limited even at other costs. Similarly, I don't know whether most philosophers think that the burden of proof for a long school closure was anywhere near met, especially given the effects on the most disadvantaged children. With schools, the inequality dimension and the age risk dimension that I mentioned above interacted in an important way. People sometimes say that lockdowns were like World War II blackouts. I discussed this a bit in my article as an outsider to value theory. What about the insiders? What do people think about charging people with criminal offences for advocating protests, as certainly happened in Australia, and so on? I know what a very small number of moral philosophers think about these things, but not many. What might explain this? Some people, unlike Singer and Cam, may not want to write for rapid publication places, Boston Review, The Conversation, and so on. And I'm sure they did discuss these things in classes. We might expect publication to take some time. Perhaps, but it has been a while. I think it would have been reasonable to have had special issues of the leading journals, or at least many papers, well before now. Reasonable to expect journals to have had papers in hand by the end of 2020, say, and papers out a year or so after. It's now 2023. A few days before this talk, I looked at every issue of two journals, Philosophy and Public Affairs and Ethics, all the issues between now and January 2021 to see if I'd missed some things. I found one article, the Obermann article on lockdowns and freedom, which is squarely in the area I'm talking about, in Ethics last year. I found one paper in the journal Ethics and zero in Philosophy and Public Affairs. What else might explain it? Well, perhaps mainly this. In online discussions of this topic, when I've raised some of these queries, a reply I get back is, this is a health issue. It's specialized. It's for health professionals, bioethicists, and health policy people. I reject that thought. Those people certainly have their role and have written a lot, but philosophy department people had and have our role too. The questions I mentioned above about enforcement and compulsion, about the old and the young, schools and inequality, etc., those questions are general. As Cam and Lawford-Smith showed in their papers, they do repay a look from a philosopher's vantage point. And where factual knowledge is uncertain, philosophers might discuss idealized cases, perhaps. We don't usually shy away from that approach. We can compare for a moment an earlier crisis to this one, the Vietnam War, especially as it took shape in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Philosophers did get involved in that, not just on the radical left anti-war side, also on the other side. In Australia, conservative philosophers such as Armstrong were conspicuous in debate. Putnam was conspicuous on the other side in the US. So when people say to me, it's the health people who should comment on COVID, I say, would you have said that about Vietnam? Would you have said we can't comment on the bombing of Cambodia because that's a military matter? Can't comment on the domino theory regarding international communism because it's an international relations matter. This would not have been taken seriously at the time, and that would have been right. What else might explain it? Well, politics might be part of it. Most of the people on my list who did get involved are in the UK and Australia. Especially in the US, there may have been a sense that to even question some of these things is to give credibility to Donald Trump, who also questioned them. And all I can say is that I hope that was not it. Now, as should be clear, I hope, but should be also entirely explicit, it's not that I'm criticizing philosophers for not agreeing with me on these issues. I've been critical of some mainstream COVID policies. Cam and Bramble seem basically okay with mainstream policies. Singer was okay with vaccine mandates, although wary of lockdowns. Obermann argued that lockdowns don't compromise freedom. Now, I disagree with that, but I'm very glad he wrote the paper. What I'm objecting to is the tendency, as I see it, not to much engage and to leave this gap. What might we have done more of specifically? Well, earlier I discussed two ways of doing philosophy in a crisis. There's the application of theories, especially from value theory, and using the crisis to prompt new work as it exposes and reconfigures questions. Now, the two will tend to combine. If a crisis has non-trivial complexity, then simple applications of existing theories may often fail to get traction, and the second role will then be furthered. The crisis becomes a prompt to innovation, as well as something we might bring philosophical ideas on. And I hope that in the future this might happen with COVID. I can certainly see some avenues. On the question of the relation between the interests of younger and older people, I can imagine that some philosophers came out of COVID thinking that such prioritization, which looked reasonable perhaps ahead of time, is just too problematic, more problematic than it seemed before we had a problem that made the question so vivid. And we might then have to rethink that issue. COVID policies induced a near complete suspension of ordinary life, of behavior patterns we take for granted in many countries, patterns that we don't usually think need to be protected with legislation, and not for a short period. I have wondered whether this shows that many people, including philosophers, had in fact rethought and revised their official sloganish positions regarding individual liberty more than they had realized before COVID. So the suspension of rights and the coercion seen in the UK, Canada, and Australia, and so on, seemed more acceptable in practice once in place than they would have predicted in the abstract. All this was not thought about as much as I think it might have been during COVID, but we can certainly think about it now. All in all, I don't think the philosophy profession did too well in this crisis. We faced an intellectually novel and important event and didn't say enough about it. I see this as an event in the history of philosophy and not a good one. Okay, that's all about COVID. Let me now just say a couple of things to finish about the crisis in the Ukraine. Now, I mentioned the Vietnam War as an earlier crisis where philosophers did get more involved. How about the Ukraine war? How similar is it to these other crises in relation to the role for philosophy? Well, here I am uncertain. I'm in full agreement with the West's support of Ukraine. I approve of what the Biden administration has been doing in particular. Now, when I say those things and ask myself whether I'm saying or thinking them qua philosopher or just qua person, so far I think it is more qua person. But that, I take it, is part of what this event is about. I would like to learn, would like to see other people press on these relationships. How might our decisions in this area be helped by philosophical ideas over and above the very basic liberal ideas that have made their way from philosophy into familiar political practice? And secondly, how might this crisis, like others, be a prompt to innovation, to taking our philosophical ideas further? I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Peter, for an excellent talk. If you don't mind, we have a little bit of time. I'd like to sort of follow up with a couple questions, maybe just to help me get clearer on sort of what you imagine the role of a philosopher in a time of crisis by sort of making an analogy. So I'm at Massey College here in Toronto, and it's a interdisciplinary college. And when the COVID crisis hits, the chemists and biologists, some of them in the middle of their PhD, just dropped their work to work on how aerosols spread. And others were working on vaccines and trying to develop vaccines. So they stopped their current research and just did a pivot. And they were able to do so because they had a special expertise in chemistry or biology. Is this kind of what you imagine moral and political philosophers should be doing? They're currently working on a particular research program, but they have a special expertise. And so when something like the COVID crisis hits, they need to drop and respond accordingly in the same way that the biologists and chemists did when COVID hit.
To some extent, yes, that is what I think they might have done. And my experience is very similar to yours with respect to fields outside of philosophy. I know a lot of biologists and hang around with biologists a lot. And when COVID came, not all, but many of the biologists I know, they dropped everything. Now, some of them had to drop everything because they were lab scientists and they couldn't continue in their labs. But even those who weren't or who had choices, many of them dropped everything and immediately began looking for something they could do that would be directly relevant. Some of them started modeling gene trees when the sequence information became available. Others began doing quick computer models of various interventions. Whenever I sent an email to a biologist querying some policy question, what I'd often get back is some, back of the envelope or back of the laptop, quick models that they had been working on that might be informative about this. So there was a tendency, I think, in some fields to not perhaps drop everything, but to drop a lot of what was being done and try to do something directly useful. And some philosophers clearly did do this. But I guess some aspects of the more negative part of my talk could be seen as wondering why there wasn't more of that.
Right. And so the idea, just to push on the analogy maybe a bit more, is that the appearance of the virus raised new questions that the biologists had to answer. And as you were talking, it also, the crisis raised new questions that moral and political philosophers ought to have been answering and taking seriously. And
actually, that's interesting. That might be a bit of a difference for the biologists. Okay. I think in some cases, maybe not so much the modeling of interventions, but on the more squarely biological side, it was a question of applying the tools they had to a new problem and trying to do so as quickly as they could and trying to make a contribution. It's, as I was wanting to emphasize, it's the nature of philosophy to be looking for the new angles, the new connections, the reconfiguration of questions that we thought we already understood. And I think that in the area of in some areas surrounding inequality, in some areas surrounding coercion, the role of policing, and the suspension of liberties, there was quite a lot in COVID that was new. It wasn't just a familiar kind of problem to which ideas about liberty that philosophers had in their toolkit for years might be applied. It required and requires doing things a little bit differently because of the interaction between the age side, the inequality side, the fact that what might have initially seemed like a suspension of liberties that's extreme but very short-lived, the fact that it didn't turn out to be short-lived in a lot of places. It turned out to go on for a very long time. There's a good question. What's the relationship between sort of short, acute suspensions of liberties that would never normally be questioned, and a kind of quasi-normalization on a sort of year-long basis of those measures? Right. That, to me at least, was a new question about liberties. It wasn't a familiar one.
Right. Maybe one more question, which sort of circles back to the theme of the conference, namely a benefit event for Ukraine. I sense that you maybe had a bit more skepticism about philosophy's ability to respond to this crisis vis-a-vis or in comparison to the COVID crisis. That my sense is that you see that it's more of a humanitarian response than a philosophical response in this case. And I know that we have some Ukrainian philosophers who are participating in this event and also in some ways being very active on the ground in Ukraine. And I think they themselves might see a role for philosophy. Maybe it's not quite the same as COVID, but I suppose the way I see the work they're doing might fall under the category of sort of the incubator role, that there's this crisis in Ukraine and now they need to think, okay, our society has been disrupted and we need to think about how we're going to rebuild. And there's a place sort of for philosophy to think about new ideas in this crisis and what we're doing next and how we can call the world's attention to our sort of support. Maybe that's a different question, but I think they're thinking very hard about sort of next steps, moral and political philosophers. What society do we want to have given that this crisis has created this rupture and potentially a potential to rebuild our society from the ground up? And maybe one other thing, I don't know if this is a question for you, but I think that the special skill set of philosophers has been used in Ukraine in some ways to sort of debunk Russian disinformation and propaganda, pointing out falsities and false reasoning and this kind of stuff. So I don't know, you sort of ended on maybe unsure about what the role of philosophy might be in Ukraine. So this seems to be what Ukrainians are doing. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but. Yeah,
I do. I meant to sound curious and unsure rather than skeptical. That was one term you used. I'm not skeptical about the relevance of philosophical ideas to the Ukraine crisis. Curious and unsure, though. It's not like COVID where I can sort of, I can see the seller's type role just present, and I wonder why some things weren't pursued more than they were. On that point, though, the one of the themes that you emphasize, which is the rebuilding stage, the need once the worst acute stage is over, how to approach the rebuilding of a society that's been through so much trauma. Okay, right. That I accept that. I think that's a very natural candidate for a place where philosophical ideas will indeed be relevant. I hadn't thought of that one, and I think that's a good example.
Yeah. Fantastic. Peter, we're basically out of time, but I want to thank you for participating in this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. I would like to thank everybody in the audience for attending and participating. I encourage you to contribute what you can. It means a lot to me and to the philosophers in Ukraine who I just mentioned. So thanks again, Peter. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. I'm very glad to be part of this. Thanks very much.